She interrupted the trial and shouted, "The stepfather is lying." What the girl revealed shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Amina sat on the living room floor, her small hands carefully arranging colored pencils in a neat row. Her mother, Layla, hummed softly in the kitchen as the smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air. It was their Saturday morning tradition: pancakes with syrup, fresh fruit, and laughter echoing through the house. Layla would dance around the kitchen, twirling with a wooden spoon as if it were a microphone, singing old R&B songs while Amina giggled and clapped along. The house was warm and alive, filled with vibrant colors and personal touches that made it feel like a haven. Framed pictures of their family adorned the walls, most of them featuring Layla and Amina smiling side by side. On the bookshelf sat a collection of books about strong black women in history, which Layla often read aloud to Amina at bedtime. She wanted her daughter to grow up proud of her heritage and unafraid to embrace who she was. Layla's voice rang out from the kitchen, cheerful and light. "Amina, come taste this batter. I think it's our best one yet." Amina jumped to her feet, her braids bouncing as she ran to the kitchen. She dipped her finger into the bowl and tasted it, scrunching her nose before breaking into a grin. "It's perfect, Mama." Layla leaned down and kissed her forehead. "That's because it's made with love," she said, wiping a smudge of flour from Amina's cheek. Everything about that morning felt safe. It felt whole, but nothing would ever be the same again. The following Monday, Layla kissed Amina goodbye at the school gate, promising to pick her up early so they could visit the park. Amina skipped into her classroom, clutching the new coloring book her mother had given her that morning. By lunchtime, the principal walked into the classroom, her expression serious. She whispered something to the teacher, who immediately turned toward Amina with soft, worried eyes. The principal beckoned her, and Amina's stomach tightened. In the office, a tall man with a sharp jaw and piercing blue eyes stood by the window. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he didn't look at her when she walked in. She knew him. Greg, her stepfather. He had married her mother just a year earlier, but he had never felt like family. "Amina," the principal said, her voice careful and measured, "there's been an accident." Amina blinked at her, then turned to Greg. "Where's Mama?" Her voice trembled. Greg finally looked at her, his expression blank and cold. "She's gone," he said flatly. The words didn't make sense. "Gone? Gone where?" Amina shook her head. "No, she's not. She was coming to get me." "She's dead," he interrupted. "It was a car accident. That's it. You're coming home with me." Tears flooded her eyes as she stumbled back, but Greg didn't move to comfort her. He just waited, his eyes sharp and impatient. The drive home was silent. Amina sat curled in the back seat, hugging her backpack as tears streamed down her face. Greg didn't speak. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't even glance at her through the rearview mirror. When they pulled into the driveway, the house that had once been warm and full of light now looked foreign. The curtains were closed, and the garden had already begun to wilt. Amina stepped inside and felt the air shift. It was heavy, cold. Greg dropped his keys on the counter and turned to her. "Go to your room." "But now." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch. She hurried down the hall and into her bedroom, shutting the door behind her. She stared at the walls, still covered with colorful drawings and posters her mother had hung, but the room no longer felt like hers. That night, Amina cried herself to sleep, clutching her teddy bear. She kept waiting for her mother to walk through the door to tell her it was all a mistake. But no one came. The days blurred into each other. Greg barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was to give orders or scold her for something trivial, leaving her shoes by the door, spilling juice on the counter. He stopped cooking for her, instead leaving cans of soup or dry cereal on the table, as if expecting her to fend for herself. Amina tried to hold on to the memories of her mother. She drew pictures of her, wrote letters she couldn't send, and whispered prayers at night asking for her to come back. But Greg made it clear that any mention of Layla was forbidden. "She's dead," he snapped one evening when Amina tried to ask about her mother's favorite song. "Stop bringing her up." His voice was sharp and final, and Amina knew better than to argue. Over time, the house grew darker. Greg removed most of Layla's things, her clothes, her books, even the framed photographs that had lined the shelves. It was as if he wanted to erase her entirely. Amina felt invisible. She avoided him as much as possible, spending most of her time in her room or outside when she could sneak away. But even outside wasn't safe. The kids at school started to echo some of the things Greg said at home. They mocked her hair, her skin, and the way she spoke. One boy called her dirty, and another said his dad told him people like her didn't belong. Amina wanted to tell someone. She wanted to tell her grandmother, Evelyn, but Greg rarely let her visit. When Evelyn did come by, he was polite but firm, brushing off her questions and insisting that Amina was fine. "You're spoiling her," he said once when Evelyn brought over a homemade pie. "She needs to learn how to take care of herself." Amina wanted to scream that it wasn't true. She wanted to tell her grandmother everything. The hunger, the loneliness, the way Greg looked at her like she was a stain he couldn't scrub out. But the fear stopped her. Fear of what he might do. Fear of losing what little she had left, and so Amina stayed quiet. But something inside her knew that this was only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows in Greg's house seemed to grow darker. Amina's world had shrunk to the walls of her bedroom and the harsh voice that echoed through the halls. Gone were the sounds of laughter, the warm smells of cinnamon and vanilla, and the gentle hands that tucked her into bed. In their place was silence, heavy, suffocating, and cold. Greg's behavior shifted from indifference to cruelty. At first, he barely acknowledged her existence, treating her more like an unwanted guest than a child in mourning. But as time passed, his hostility became more deliberate. It was in the way he looked at her, sharp, hard stares that made her stomach churn, and in the way he spoke, each word clipped and loaded with disdain. "You eat too much," he snapped one evening when Amina reached for a second slice of bread. "No wonder your kind always looks like beggars, greedy and lazy." Amina froze, her fingers tightening around the slice. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she set the bread down and lowered her head, her appetite disappearing. Greg's comments became sharper, more frequent. He ridiculed her hair, calling it a mess of wires and threatening to cut it off if she didn't fix it. When she tried to comb it the way her mother had taught her, he yanked the brush out of her hands and threw it across the room. "No one's going to take you seriously looking like that," he said. "You should be grateful I'm even letting you stay here. People like you should know their place." The words stung, but what hurt more was the look in his eyes, a coldness that made it clear he saw her as less than human. Amina learned to avoid him as much as possible. She tiptoed through the house, careful not to make noise, and spent hours in her room with the door closed. But even there, she couldn't escape his voice. "You think hiding makes you invisible? You're not. You're just pathetic. he yelled one night after finding her sitting in the corner of her closet, hugging her knees. When she didn't respond, he stormed into the room and grabbed her by the arm, dragging her to her feet. "Stop crying," he shouted, shaking her. "You're not special, Amina. You're nothing." The tears stopped, but not because she wanted them to. They stopped because fear took over, wrapping itself around her like a heavy chain. At school, things weren't any better. Amina's classmates picked up on the way she carried herself, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, and took it as a sign of weakness. "Why does your hair look like that?" one girl asked, tugging at one of her braids. "Do you even have a dad?" another boy taunted. "Or did he leave like all the others?" Their words echoed the things Greg said at home, and Amina started to wonder if they were right. Teachers noticed her change in behavior, but never pressed the issue. When Greg showed up for parent meetings, he put on a performance, smiling, shaking hands, and talking about how difficult it had been to raise Amina after her mother's death. "She's been acting out," he said, lowering his voice to make it seem like he was being discreet. "You know how kids are at this age, especially after a loss." No one questioned him. Even at home, Greg knew how to cover his tracks. When Evelyn visited, he made sure the house looked clean and that Amina was dressed properly. He'd even cook a meal, pretending to be the picture of a caring father. "She's fine, Evelyn," he said once when Evelyn commented on how thin Amina looked. "You're overreacting." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She started visiting more often, and each time she found new reasons to worry. Amina's silence, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements. Evelyn tried to talk to Amina in private, but the girl wouldn't say anything. Greg had made it clear what would happen if she did. "Please," she whispered one night, standing outside his bedroom door. "I'm hungry." But Greg didn't open the door. Amina spent the night curled up on the floor, her stomach growling. As the days dragged on, her isolation deepened. She stopped answering questions in class and stopped drawing pictures of her mother. It hurt too much to remember what she'd lost. Greg fed on her silence. He pushed her harder, testing her limits as if daring her to fight back. "You think you're better than me?" he spat one day, shoving her plate of food off the table. "You're nothing but a reminder of what she did to me, ruined my life with her stupid pride and her ugly daughter." The words cut deeper than any slap could have. One night, Amina overheard Greg talking on the phone. His voice was low, but the words carried. "No, she doesn't know anything," he said. "She's too scared to ask questions." Amina's heart raced. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear more. "I told you, it's done. The insurance money will come through soon. I just need to keep things quiet until then." Her breath caught in her throat. Insurance money. He was talking about her mother. The realization hit her like a punch. Greg didn't just hate her, he had hated her mother too. And now he was waiting to profit from her death. Amina barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made her jump, and every shadow felt like a threat. She thought about running away, but where would she go? Who would believe her? The only person she could think of was Evelyn. The next time Evelyn visited, Amina pulled her aside and tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Evelyn noticed the fear in her eyes and squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, baby," she said softly. "I won't let him hurt you." But Greg overheard. After Evelyn left, he cornered Amina in the kitchen. "You think she can save you?" he hissed. "She's too old, too weak. No one's coming for you." Amina believed him, but she also knew she couldn't survive much longer. Something had to change, and soon. Amina sat in the corner of her room, knees drawn to her chest, the dim light from the hallway casting a long shadow across the floor. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger had become a constant ache, one she had learned to endure like the sharp words and hard stares Greg threw her way. Fear had settled in her bones, but tonight it felt heavier than usual. Greg's voice echoed from the living room below, low and sharp. Amina strained to hear, her heart racing as she recognized the anger simmering beneath his words. She crept to the top of the stairs, her bare feet silent against the worn wood, and leaned forward just enough to see him pacing. "She's too quiet," Greg said, his voice harsh. "It's making people suspicious. Evelyn won't let this go. She's already sniffing around." Amina's breath caught. He was talking about her grandmother. A second voice, one she didn't recognize, answered. What if she pushes harder? What if she brings in social services? Greg stopped pacing and slammed his fist down on the table. "She won't. I'll handle it. I always handle it." The confidence in his voice sent a chill down Amina's spine. "Besides," Greg continued, lowering his voice, "she doesn't have the money or the connections to win. And the girl, she's nothing. She's scared of her own shadow. Even if she talked, no one would believe her." Amina clenched her fists. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to stay still. "She's just like her mother," Greg sneered, "thinking she's better than me. But look where that got her." The man on the phone hesitated. "You're sure the insurance is solid?" "Positive. I checked it again yesterday. Everything's in order. Once it clears, she's out of my hair for good." Amina's stomach dropped. The words were like a slap, each one confirming what she had feared since overhearing his first phone call. Greg didn't just hate her mother. He had done something to her. Her hands shook as memories pieced themselves together. The way Greg had avoided questions about the accident. The rushed funeral with no time for goodbyes. The whispers on the phone late at night. He had sabotaged her mother's car. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. Amina stumbled back to her room, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone, but Greg's voice echoed in her ears. "No one's coming for you." She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as the truth settled over her. The next morning, Amina avoided Greg's eyes as she slipped into her clothes and gathered her school bag. She hadn't slept, and her body felt heavy, but she forced herself to keep moving. Greg barely looked up as she left the house, and for the first time in weeks, Amina felt relief as she stepped outside. At school, she spotted her grandmother waiting near the gate, her face lined with worry. Amina's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run to her, to bury her face in Evelyn's coat and let the tears fall, but she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she walked toward her slowly, her heart pounding. "You okay, baby?" Evelyn asked, kneeling to meet her eyes. Amina hesitated before shaking her head. "No," she whispered. Evelyn's face hardened. She took Amina's hand and led her to a bench near the parking lot, her voice low and steady. "Tell me everything." Amina's words tumbled out in broken pieces, the hunger, the yelling, the bruises, and finally, the phone calls. When she finished, Evelyn's hands were trembling. "He killed her," Amina said, her voice barely audible. "He made her car break. He said so." Evelyn pulled her close, holding her as tightly as she could. "You're safe now," she said. "I promise." But Amina wasn't sure if she believed her. The fight for custody started almost immediately. Evelyn hired a lawyer and filed an emergency petition, but Greg fought back hard. He painted Evelyn as an overbearing grandmother who didn't know how to let go. "She's too old to care for a child," his lawyer argued, "and she's living on a fixed income. She can't give Amina what she needs." Evelyn's lawyer countered with evidence of neglect, medical records showing Amina's weight loss, photos of bruises, and testimony from teachers who had noticed the changes in her behavior. Still, Greg wasn't done. He began showing up at school unexpectedly, showering Amina with gifts and forcing her to pose for pictures with him. "See how happy we are," he said loudly to the teachers, but Amina knew better. At home, his kindness vanished. He grew more unpredictable, slamming doors and muttering under his breath. He accused Amina of trying to ruin his life, of lying to get attention. "You think anyone cares about you?" he snarled one night. "You're nothing without me. Nothing." But Amina wasn't nothing. Not anymore. The day of the hearing came, and Amina sat beside Evelyn, her hands trembling as they waited for the judge. Greg walked in wearing a suit, his lawyer at his side. He smiled at Amina, but his eyes were cold. The lawyers presented their cases, but it wasn't enough. Amina knew what she had to do. She stood up, her voice shaking but steady. "He doesn't love me," she said. "He doesn't even like me. He hurt me. He hurt my mom, and he wants to get rid of me too." The courtroom fell silent. "He killed her," Amina continued. "I heard him say it. He broke her car so he could get her money, and now he wants me to go away so he can keep it." Greg's face turned red. He jumped to his feet shouting that she was lying, but the judge silenced him. "We'll investigate this claim immediately," the judge said. Greg's confidence cracked as officers approached him. Amina clung to Evelyn as Greg was led away, his threats echoing in her ears. But for the first time she wasn't afraid. She had told the truth, and someone had finally listened. The courtroom was silent as the judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing. Amina clutched Evelyn's hand, her small fingers trembling against her grandmother's warm, steady grip. Greg had been taken away in handcuffs, his angry protests still echoing in Amina's ears, but the sound no longer scared her. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. The judge's final words confirmed that Evelyn would receive temporary custody while the investigation into Greg's actions continued. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was enough. Amina wouldn't have to go back to that house. She wouldn't have to face Greg's anger, his cruelty, or his icy stares. As they walked out of the courthouse, Evelyn knelt down and cupped Amina's face. "We're going home, baby," she said softly. Amina wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that home could mean something safe again. The car ride back to Evelyn's house was quiet. Amina stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The world outside looked so normal. People walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, couples holding hands. It felt wrong, somehow, that everything could look so ordinary when her world had been anything but. When they reached Evelyn's small house, Amina hesitated at the door. It was nothing like Greg's cold, sterile home. The walls here were warm beige, decorated with family photos and handmade quilts. The scent of lavender drifted through the air, but stepping inside felt like crossing into another world, one she wasn't sure she could trust yet. Evelyn seemed to sense her hesitation. "It's okay, baby," she said. "You're safe here. I promise." Amina nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. Over the next few days, Evelyn worked tirelessly to make the house feel like home. She turned the spare bedroom into Amina's room, repainting the walls a soft lavender and hanging up fairy lights around the window. She set out stuffed animals, books, and art supplies, things that reminded Amina of the happier days before Greg. But it wasn't just the room that changed. Evelyn cooked warm meals, sat with Amina during breakfast, and helped her with her homework in the evenings. She read bedtime stories and left the door open at night so the hallway light could seep in, chasing away the dark. Still, Amina struggled. The nightmares didn't stop. She woke up sweating, the echoes of Greg's voice filling her ears. She flinched at sudden noises and jumped whenever someone knocked at the door. Evelyn noticed. One evening, after Amina woke up screaming, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed and ran her fingers through the girl's hair. "It's going to take time," she said softly. "You've been through so much, baby. But you're not alone anymore." Amina wanted to believe her. She wanted to trust that this was real, that Evelyn wouldn't disappear the way her mother had. But part of her still expected the worst. School wasn't any easier. Even though Greg was gone, the whispers didn't stop. Some kids asked questions, too many questions about the court case, about her crazy stepdad, about why she was living with her grandmother. Others repeated the same racist insults she'd heard before, and Amina found herself shrinking back, retreating into silence. But Evelyn wasn't about to let her give up. "We're going to fix this," she said one afternoon after Amina came home crying. She enrolled Amina in therapy, where the girl slowly began to untangle the mess of fear and anger inside her. The therapist encouraged her to draw pictures and write letters to her mother, letters she could never send, but that helped her feel connected to Layla. Evelyn also took her to art classes at the community center. At first, Amina was hesitant. She sat at the back of the room, doodling quietly while the other kids laughed and painted bold, colorful shapes. But over time, the colors began to spread. Amina's drawings grew brighter, full of swirling patterns and bold, hopeful lines. "She's got talent," the art teacher told Evelyn one afternoon. Evelyn beamed, but Amina still doubted herself. Then, one day, she painted a picture of her mother, smiling, radiant, and strong. She showed it to Evelyn, who framed it and hung it in the living room. "She'd be so proud of you," Evelyn said. And for the first time, Amina believed it. But even as her world began to heal, the shadow of Greg's trial loomed over them. The police investigation revealed evidence of tampering with Layla's car, and Greg faced charges of manslaughter and fraud. Evelyn shielded Amina from most of the details, but the girl overheard enough to know the truth. Greg had killed her mother. The final court date arrived, and Evelyn insisted that Amina didn't have to go, but Amina wanted to. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched in her lap, as the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Greg didn't look at her as he was led away, but Amina stared straight ahead, refusing to look away. Afterward, Evelyn hugged her tightly. "It's over," she said, but Amina knew it wasn't. Not really. The scars Greg left would take time to fade, but for the first time, Amina felt like she had control, like she could decide what happened next. In the weeks that followed, Amina and Evelyn settled into a routine. They planted flowers in the garden, painted the front porch, and spent weekends baking cookies and watching movies. Amina started to make friends at school, kids who didn't care about her past, who just liked her for who she was. She joined the art club and even entered one of her paintings into a local competition. When she won second place, Evelyn cried. "You're amazing," she said. Amina smiled. She still thought about her mother every day. She kept the framed painting in her room and whispered goodnight to it before bed. Sometimes the memories hurt, The sound of Layla's laugh, the warmth of her hugs, but other times they felt like a lifeline, a reminder that love didn't disappear. On the anniversary of Layla's death, Evelyn took Amina to the park where they used to go as a family. They sat under the big oak tree and laid flowers at its base. "She'd want you to be happy," Evelyn said. Amina looked up at the sky, the sun shining through the branches, and for the first time she believed it was possible. Her past hadn't disappeared, the pain hadn't vanished, but she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends and family to discuss important topics. Watch our other videos. There are many more stories to come. Write in the comments where you're watching us from.